the dreaming spires of Oxford, and among them, a rookery. There's a jackdaw on a chimney pot. And here's my suburban back garden. It's not exactly a game reserve, but it's a pretty good hunting ground for the naturalist. There's the hedgehog, and scurrying into my pond, a newt. Now, what else have we got here? Ah, the long-tailed titserback. And there she is again. Lovely. The kestrel. After the sparrows, I should think. Fantastic bird. Hello there. My name's Malcolm Coe, and I'm an ecologist here in Oxford, sitting in my garden, enjoying the wildlife. And to do it, I don't even have to move from my chair. You know, I've spent most of my life in some of the wildest places in the world. On safari in Africa, watching elephants, rhino, and lions. But I never cease to be amazed whenever I get back home, just how much wildlife there is here in a perfectly ordinary garden. This seems to surprise so many people because they fondly imagine that wildlife only occurs in wild places and that any animals that we do find in town are nothing more than a ragged bunch of scavengers that are raking around in our dustbins. What this city safari is going to show us is that this just isn't true. Now, what interests me is how it is that all these animals manage to survive so far from the countryside. Well, a big part of that answer is right down here at my feet. You'll see, it's these green plants, the green material of the grass in my lawn, which provides the basis for an ecosystem in the town, just as it does in the countryside, or indeed, for that matter, absolutely anywhere else in the world. It's like a miniature jungle down there. There are spittlebugs sucking juice from the grass and many other insects up in the green canopy. Woodlice and beetles scurry among the roots. And there are even predators like the wolf spider hunting insects. This is all natural food for wildlife in towns. Starlings don't just come to my lawn for bread. They're after insects as well. In fact, it's only because you've got plenty of insect food in towns that birds like long-tailed tits can survive there. They feed their young entirely on grubs and build a lovely domed nest with cobwebs and feathers. Here's one removing the chick's droppings. These birds aren't nesting in my garden, but since the air in our cities has become cleaner, they've become quite common in towns, even in the centre of London. All the wild creatures that you've seen in my garden can, in fact, be found somewhere in the capital. It's a mistake many people make to believe that the only wildlife in London is locked up in Regent's Park Zoo. There is a lot of wildlife here, but I don't mean the lions. Living among the captive animals are truly wild creatures. like this little bird, the moorhen. Every year, a pair of moorhens nest here in the lion enclosure, unconcerned about visitors to the zoo or the king of the beasts. Now, moorhens need insect food to provide their chicks with a rich protein diet, and they find plenty on the lion's pool. They do scavenge to feed themselves, but without natural food, it's unlikely they'd breed successfully here. And look at this. The moorhen has caught a fish. This may not impress the lions, but it's an amazing example of how truly wild birds can find a hunting ground in a city. Mallard chicks too need insect food and search for it within a few feet of the lions. In fact, the lion's pool is valuable territory for these wild birds, and the mallard and the moorhens will actually fight over it. There's a lot more wildlife here, living among the captive zoo animals. Now, the grey squirrel, which lives and breeds wild in the zoo, does do a lot of scavenging. So too does the magpie. But the behaviour of these creatures is little different from their country cousins. Here, the magpie's collecting and hoarding peanuts. The grey squirrel does the same. But watch this amazing bit of behaviour. The magpie watches the squirrel and waits for it to finish burying the peanuts. Then it hops down to steal the squirrel's hoard. Though the food these creatures are competing for is a handout from man, their behaviour is wild. And in fact, magpies and squirrels need a great range of food and nesting material to survive here. You've also got wild grey herons coming in to steal fish from the sea lions in the zoo. Now, the herons are taking a natural food provided by man. But they couldn't survive here just by scavenging. The birds that nest in the heronry close to the zoo are reliant on all the trees, green plants and fresh water of Regent's Park. It's a great example of a really exotic bird exploiting the green islands of the city. London's lakes, like the Serpentine in Hyde Park, are rich in insect food. This attracts birds, which have made their own way over here from Africa. Here's a swallow, just arrived after a 6,000-mile journey in which it's crossed the Sahara Desert. Many such birds stop to feed in Hyde Park on their summer migration. There are house martins here too, and they actually stay to nest near to the park in Knightsbridge. It's a lovely sight as these migrant birds from Africa find the mud for their nests near a cafe at the end of the lake. When they've scooped the mud up with their beaks, they fly upmarket to the French embassy. Here they mould the mud into their nests, which are tucked into the stucco rosettes under the eaves. Every town has one or other of these summer visitors. Here in Oxford, we have swifts, which arrive every year from Africa to nest in the tower of our university museum. And it takes these little birds a bit longer than it takes me to get back here these days. And yet, they make it entirely to feed on insects, though they use a man-made structure to nest in. Now, I think I've proved that wildlife in town isn't just scavenging for food, because birds like swifts feed on the natural products of our parks and gardens and the lakes of our cities. But of course, there is another kind of ecosystem in the city based on all the muck and rubbish that we throw away. And it's interesting to ask which species can survive almost entirely without green plants. The ordinary town pigeon has a special ability among birds. Both male and female can make from junk food like bread a white gooey substance called pigeon's milk. This provides the young with the rich protein food they need, and one of the secrets of the pigeon's success in town is that it's not reliant on insect food. House sparrows also scavenge, of course, but like other birds, they do try to feed their young insect food, which they pick from the trees. Whatever sparrows are feeding on, they're always in danger of becoming a natural meal for this bird. At the top of the food chain in town is the kestrel. It'll hunt sparrows even in the centre of the city. House sparrows make up a big part of the kestrel's diet here and in suburbia. So you've got sparrows which eat popcorn, becoming a protein meal for the kestrel. There are so many surprising ways in which our cities, even industrial Sheffield, can provide conditions on which wildlife will thrive. This may look like the countryside, but it is in fact an overgrown sewage works.
A wonderful entrance. Marvellous, isn't it?
For ecologist Keith Clarkson, who knows the site well, it's a great place for a safari. With him is botanist Oliver Gilbert.
Well, this is the start of the site. I'll have a quick look at the birds that are around and perhaps if you fancy looking at some of the plants.
And I'll see what I can find in the plant line.
And how about
shall we meet up somewhere over here in an hour or so?
That sounds a great idea,
Compare
yeah.
notes?
Excellent. Yeah, smash it.
All right.
See you later. This works is mostly disused now, but you still get some raw sewage sludge dumped here, and that's one of the great attractions for the wildlife. It smells pretty bad, but let's take a look into the warm, moist interior. It's quite incredible what you can find. There are all kinds of larvae. Here's a blowfly emerging from its pupae. It's a world in miniature with its own special beauty. But above all, the little mites and flies and maggots are a rich food source for other creatures. Here's a young pied wagtail finding plenty to eat on the sludge. There's a magpie, which has also got something. You can see lots of grey wagtails here too. And here's a young starling. Large flocks of these birds feed on the sludge. Much of the site is now overgrown, and there's a whole range of habitats. The River Don flows through, which is great for martins and swifts. The floodwaters are diverted onto the sludge, where they form shallow lagoons. Here you see migrant birds like the common sandpiper. Others actually nest here. There's always a pair or two of little ring plover, which are rare in England. And there's a dabchick, or little grebe, feeding its young on fish caught in a lagoon. There's probably a greater range of habitat here than in many rural areas, and I'm sure Oliver will have stumbled across some unusual plants.
This is really astonishing. A mass of biting stonecrop in full flower. The soil here is extremely shallow, and it's growing actually over the concrete floor of a sludge tank. And there's only about a centimetre of soil, and it's an extremely drought-resistant plant. And it's one of the few plants which can grow in such a dry habitat. And it got here, found the conditions to its liking, and have just taken over. The natural habitat of biting stonecrop is limestone cliffs. It's just one example of the wide range of soil types and plant communities on the site. There's a bullfinch eating the seeds of rosebay willow herb. This is the bank of an old lagoon, now well colonised by flowers. This one's red campion. All these plant communities have grown up in the past 20 years. There's no mature woodland, but the site's got almost everything else. Hi.
Well then, Oliver.
Hi.
Have you had a successful time?
Yes, I have.
Good.
And you?
Not bad at all, thanks, yeah. An amazing variety of things, really. It's fascinating just to look around and see such a marvellously complex and interwoven ecosystem that all hinges on human waste.
Yes.
Earlier on we had kestrels flying over, which are actually feeding young in the factory behind us. On this side, they hunt voles that live in the long grass.
Here's the natural world on a man-made green island, humming with a great range of wildlife. And of course, the city's wildlife changes with the seasons as it does in the countryside. In late summer, the green plants wither and the insect food disappears. Swifts and martins flock before their return to Africa. But in winter, the town still has resources which will draw in migrants from the countryside. Look at this, a short-eared owl hunting voles on Rainham Marsh in East London. You'll find these magnificent birds of prey on the rough grasslands of many parts of our cities during the winter, and you can watch them because they fly during the day. These urban heathlands attract other birds of prey. This is perhaps a country kestrel wintering in town. But the greatest natural resource the city has in winter is its reservoirs of fresh water. This is Walthamstow in northeast London. It's bitterly cold, but here in town the water remains open when country lakes are frozen. So this is a refuge for wildfowl for miles around. Here's a party of widgeon flying in. They join other birds, coots, tufted duck and pochard, many of which breed in northern Europe but come south in winter. There are plenty of fish in the reservoirs, food for birds, like grey herons. There's a little dunlin feeding on shrimps. Large numbers of cormorant gather here. They nest on the coast, but in winter they come inland, and London has been invaded by these birds in recent years. They form great roosts on this island tree in Walthamstow. This amazing Siberian scene in a North London suburb shows how the city's natural resources will draw in a rich variety of wildlife in both summer and winter. And you can actually find birds here that have come from Siberia. A family of Buick's swans has arrived to a cold reception from a pair of mute swans. The Buicks have flown all the way to Walthamstow from their breeding grounds in Siberia. I store apples in my garden summer house in Oxford, and just recently I noticed they'd all been nibbled. When I stalked up to the window, I found a party of wood mice having a feast. Now these lovely little creatures have crept in from the countryside into my town garden, and I began to wonder about the way in which wildlife colonizes our cities. You know, it's not only the wood mice that we've got in my summer house. We've also got foxes that come into the garden under holes in the fence or by hopping over the top. We've got grey squirrels, hedgehogs, blackbirds, magpies. We've even got a kestrel, and of course the frogs and newts in our pond. And if we add to those the butterflies and the myriads of other insects that we've got here, altogether we must have hundreds of species. Now, of course, all these animals have arrived here from the countryside. Now today, an awful lot of people will say this is because animals are adapting to life in the town, almost as if they changed their very nature. But I don't really believe that's true, because for most animals, their behaviour is more or less fixed. But there is, in fact, another way of looking at the way in which wildlife colonises our cities. Think of this as an island in a hostile sea of concrete and traffic. And of course, any animals that are going to reach this patch are going to have to get here from the countryside. What we really want to know is why is it that some creatures are successful in colonising these islands and others are not? You can take any of these patches you like, whether it's this garden or it's a large park. Now, strangely enough, one of the best studied of these islands is right in the centre of London. Now, the centre of a great city isn't much of a place for most wildlife, and you couldn't find a more hostile environment than outside Buckingham Palace. House sparrows do nest in the palace gates, and there's even a starling brood in the mouth of a stone lion. But take a look behind the palace, and it's a different world. Here we are in the 39 acres of Her Majesty's back garden, which is much bigger than mine and is quite an amazing nature reserve. The reason we know so much about what wildlife can be found here is that it's actually been studied over 20 years by a team of naturalists. They were led by a wonderful character, botanist David McClintock.
Fred, come and look at all this.
Who got help from the palace gardeners.
The survey, in fact, lasted for 5 years in the early 1960s. And in that time, we found 260 different plants, wild or naturalized. And since those days, I've added nearly another 50 since, because I still have the privilege of coming in. And it is a wonderful privilege, and I keep close watch on what comes in this garden. And I'm thrilled to find new plants. And practically every time I come in, I find a new one's arrived.
What we've got
Well,
here.
Fred, look at this.
Yeah.
Now, this is quite a discovery.
That's new, surely.
I don't think I've seen this in the palace grounds before. This is a chervil of sorts.
Yeah.
And you can eat this too if you want
Yeah.
to. There. It's good. There's a white campion coming on.
Yeah.
That'll be a nice big white flower.
Yeah.
And look at all the hemlock water droplet.
It's spraying enormously, isn't it?
Oh, look at the daisies, Fred.
Daisies, yeah.
Now, the wild plants have got here in all sorts of ways. Many, like the yellow Oxford ragwort, have wind-blown seeds. Others have got in potting plants or clinging to the clothes of visitors to garden parties.
Well, these are oxeye daisies. Some people call them marguerites. And in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, they'll be an absolute blaze of colour. Large, white, 2-inch daisies.
And And there's one amazing find here that mystifies me and David McClintock.
Well, here's one of the great specialities and surprises of this garden. It's the adder's tongue fern. You mightn't think it's a fern, but it's related to the ferns. And when it's fully out, all this will be yellow. It's a lovely sight. And it's quite amazing to find it here because it's normally a constituent of old meadowland. And we only found it here about 3 or 4 years ago. But how it got here is anybody's guess.
When we begin to think about the kinds of species that do well here, a pattern emerges. Spiders do well because they can easily travel across town. Some spin silk threads which carry them on the breeze. There are hundreds of insects like this damselfly. And feeding on insects, you've got a remarkable range of breeding birds.
Have a look at this, David.
What have you found, Fred?
We're found in the top of this azalea here.
Well, who'd have guessed it? Now, look at it.
More in.
There are about 20 different species that breed here alone in these under 40 acres. And that's not just one nest each, there are several nests, actually lots of them. But 20 is a considerable number to breed here year after year in this relatively small area.
Here's a recent arrival, the long-tailed tit, building a lovely domed nest. You'll get a change in the species here from year to year. Most summers, this little insect eater, the spotted flycatcher, nests in the garden. It's a migrant from Africa. Now, what you'll notice straight away is how well the birds do here. What a variety there is. The flamingos are imported, of course, but on the lake, you've got several kinds of wild duck. Mallard, pochard, and tufted duck, as well as Canada geese. But why are the birds so successful? It's obvious, really. They can fly. It's much harder for other animals. How would they cross the raging torrent of the traffic? There's really only one furry animal which does, using the branches of the plane trees as a bridge from Green Park. But the grey squirrel is alone. The Queen has no wood mice like those in my summer house.
We did once see one vole. That was a famous occasion. I was with Peter Crowcroft. We were coming from different directions. We both exclaimed at the same moment, "Goodness, there's a vole." We never saw it again, never seen it before or since. There was once a frog found in here, and it had a great red belly on, and it was looked on as frightfully exciting, and all sorts of photos were taken. But that was only one frog. How it got in, we can't think, and it didn't last long either. We've never found a toad, anything like that.
So while there are many more birds here than in my garden, there is less of other kinds of wildlife. It's the isolation of Buckingham Palace garden from other areas with a range of wildlife which limits what can get here. Buckingham Palace Garden is a small island, a long way from any rural area. But there are other much larger and less isolated green islands in the capital. Here we are in Richmond Park, 2,500 acres of oak woodland and rough ground with herds of red deer. Here you've got birds like jackdaws and cackling green woodpeckers that you won't find in central London. And in fact, there's an amazing variety of creatures for a city island. But the main reason for my visit here with gamekeeper David Smith was to compare two familiar animals. Now, the red fox is one of these. It is, of course, very successful in town. The badger is the other. There are lots of them here, but they haven't colonized the city as the fox has. Now let's take a look at the badger's lifestyle. Here he is dragging bedding down into his set. Badgers are social animals, living in groups in a maze of underground tunnels. They do a fair bit of scavenging, but their main food is earthworms. So what does the old badger need to survive? Well, firstly, the kind of ground in which he can dig. In this case, you can see it very clearly there. Look at it. It's sand. And if you've got sand, then you can dig in it very easily. And so, where there's plenty of sand, there will be badgers. If, for instance, you were to say, well, Buckingham Palace Gardens has got lots of sand in it, why can't it go and dig there? Just look at the badger. Great animal, short, stocky, stumpy-legged. The good old badger, he's great at crawling under little holes in fences, as we've seen all the way around here. But climbing over a fence, no. Jumping over things, no. That really isn't the badger's way of life. He stalks along, and he's a really rough old chap. The fox is a much more agile animal, and I'm sure that that is the major reason, not simply the lack of habitat, but a badger just would never have got right into the middle of the city. And this is why we have the badger coming as far as Richmond, and he sits on the top of the hill there, looking down towards the city, and as the foxes move past on their way to London, he looks at them and he says, "You must be crazy." Of course, the cunning old fox isn't crazy, but it does have a very different lifestyle from the badger. The fox can easily jump suburban fences, so it's no problem for it to get into town. So that's one big advantage the fox has over the badger. It's more agile. Another is that the fox has a much more varied diet. It eats fruit, birds, and a great range of scavenged food as well. Lastly, compared with the badger, the fox is a loner, digging its solitary hole or earth under garden sheds with no need of a maze of burrows. It's for all these reasons that the fox has been so successful at living in towns, even the centre of London. Look at this. We've even got a fox's earth hidden away by the Serpentine restaurant in Hyde Park. You'll find plenty of food there, I should think. Now you'll hear people say that the fox has adapted to town life, as if it had undergone some radical evolutionary change. But I don't see that it's much different from the country fox. The point is, the town suits it, but it doesn't suit the badger. It's not only the badger that is confined in London to the outskirts of town. So too, it seems, is this really quite comical bird, the jackdaw. Now, there used to be jackdaws in Kensington Gardens, but they've gone from there. A clue to why this is might be this scene here in Richmond Park. The jackdaws pull fur from the red deer for nesting material, a material that they couldn't find in the central parts. Maybe the jackdaw is limited to places where it can find deer or sheep. It might even need open country for some of its food as well. The jackdaw is certainly happy in small towns not far from a country. Here by the embankment you won't see jackdaws or rooks. The last rookery went from this spot in 1916. But you will see this bird, the carrion crow. Just about every London square now has its pair of crows, nesting high up in the plane trees. They raise 5 or 6 young early in the year, before the leaves are out on the trees. Now the crow belongs to the same family as the jackdaw and the rook, so why should it be successful here and not those other birds? I suspect it's to do with food. The crow eats small birds and scraps of meat, and it finds plenty of these in London, which enables it to raise its young. So the crow is very successful in London, but the jackdaw isn't. Now, of course, that could have something to do with London's enormous size, which means that its central green islands are literally miles from any real countryside, which of course limits the range of the species that can get there. In much smaller towns, like Oxford, you'll see jackdaws and rooks, as we've got here, nesting right in the centre of town, but of course flying to the country for their food. Rooks are quite happy to nest in towns if they can feed on farmland nearby. The same is true of jackdaws, which nest in Oxford's chimney pots. So the size of the town will affect what can get there. But so, of course, will the region the town's in, because that's, in fact, what determines who's out there waiting, who's ready to come and colonize the town from the surrounding countryside. Now, there's no wilder scene than this sunrise over Marsden Rock in the North Sea. The rock is a breeding ground for many seabirds, cormorants and gulls, and it's difficult to imagine any of them moving into our towns. But industrial Tyneside is not so far away. Here in the bustling centre of the city, you've got nesting one of those birds from Marsden Rock. It's the kittiwake, which you won't find in London or Oxford. This old warehouse in Gateshead has in recent years become an artificial cliff for these birds. They nest on the narrowest of ledges high above the town. Now, the warehouse isn't so very different from Marsden Rock, and kittiwakes which nest in the town can fly out to sea for their food. In fact, the town birds behave in exactly the same way as those that nest on the rock. You can't really say that the kittiwakes have altered their behaviour in order to colonise the town. They've succeeded here because they can commute between their artificial cliffs and their feeding grounds. Whatever kind of wildlife we're talking about, whether or not we're actually going to find a particular species in the town will depend on a whole series of really very complicated factors, but the basic principle will always remain the same. Now, in this pond in my garden, I've got frogs, but I haven't got any toads. Now, I'm not really quite sure why it suits the frogs and not the toads, but I think it's reasonable to presume that this is due to really quite small differences in their life cycles. It certainly isn't because the frog has obtained some amazing new adaptation to fit it in the town that the toad can't manage. Here's the old toad emerging from its winter hibernation hole in February. Now, this is a time of great sexual frenzy for these creatures, and they're all making for a breeding pond. Toads have quite large territories, maybe 2 miles from the pond, and may have a long way to travel. In towns, this means crossing roads, which, as we know, can be pretty hazardous. Males often waylay females en route to the pond and, locked in the mating embrace, get a lift there. Now, toads are very fussy about the ponds they breed in, for reasons we don't really understand, and hundreds head for the same spot. Here are the frogs behaving in much the same way. But there are critical differences which make things easier for the frogs. They hibernate in or near their breeding pond and don't have so far to travel. And again, we don't know why. They are less fussy about the ponds they use. The frog, much more than the toad, is happy in suburban garden ponds, and perhaps that's why it does better in town. It's a classic tale of two very similar creatures, one doing well and the other struggling in the strange landscape of the city. A cornfield in the Oxfordshire countryside near my home. Sometimes these days it seems more polluted and noisy out here than it is in the town. What with all these modern mechanised farming practices that are going on all around us, from sprays to grubbing up our hedges and even draining our marshes, it seems as if the countryside's becoming a pretty hostile place to live in. But at the same time, an awful lot of wildlife seems to be appearing in our towns. Now, many people put these ideas together and say, well, if the countryside's such a hostile place, Surely, in fact, what's actually happening is the animals are actually running away from the countryside and ending up in our towns. But I'm afraid that really is mostly nonsense. If the animals are moving, it's almost certainly because their populations have actually increased out here in these areas, and they're extending their range as a result. Now, the reason a lot of wildlife is doing very well today is that since Victorian times, we've become more concerned about preserving and protecting it. A great example of this is the history over the last century of this beautiful bird, the great crested grebe. It may be difficult to believe today, but hunters killed thousands of grebes in the 19th century. What they were after was the bird's breast feathers to make into grebe furs. This was the era when ladies liked to decorate their hats and dresses with feathers. And grebe plumage was in great demand. The grebe was almost driven to extinction, but not quite. A few birds survived the Victorian hunters to be admired by modern naturalists with telescopes. This is a lovely scene from the grebe's elaborate courtship display, which we can consider ourselves fortunate to see today. The grebe has done very well in the last few years, and here on Brent Reservoir in North London, there are as many breeding pairs as there were in the whole country a century ago. As the grebes have increased in number, they've moved further into town. Here's one with a fish caught in the Serpentine Lake in London's Hyde Park. It's taking the catch to its mate, who has hungry chicks to feed. Now watch this. The fish is offered head first by the parent bird to the chicks, which ride on its back. Now, the grebes have certainly not run away from the countryside to the town. They've done very well in rural areas and expanded their range. The parent birds also feed the chicks with feathers to provide them with roughage. It's the same plumage which almost drove the birds to extinction. It's not only the threat from the plumage hunters which has lifted in the past century. If you look at the old parish records in any part of the country, you'll find a chilling account of the scale of our past persecution of wildlife. Here are some entries for Plumstead, now part of South London. They show that a badger skin would fetch a shilling. polecats and otters, and everything considered a pest in the countryside has a price on its head. Victorian gamekeepers with shotguns increased the carnage. They killed everything, even herons that might eat game birds or fish. But this persecution abated with a decline in gamekeeping since the First World War. One very severely persecuted animal was the hedgehog. It will eat the eggs of pheasants. But since it's been hunted down less and less in rural areas, it has increased in numbers and has trotted into town. The parks and gardens of our cities have proved to be ideal for the hedgehog, and it's done very well here. It's quite good at climbing fences, and it finds places to hibernate, and plenty of food in suburbia. It's even developed a taste for cat food. The town has certainly opened up new and often less hostile frontiers for this animal, but it's not, as many people think, a refugee from rural areas. So a lot of wildlife is not so much running away from the countryside as actually recovering from past persecution. But that still leaves a rather open question of whether particular species are better off nowadays in town or in the countryside. Well, I suppose that really depends on what creatures we're actually talking about. This lovely bird, the mute swan, nesting by the Thames in Oxford, is certainly not better off nowadays in the city, though not long ago it was very common. The decline of the mute swan is a particularly tragic story because it has such a long and colourful history living alongside man. The annual swan upping on the Thames is a survival from the days when the birds were owned by royalty and a few privileged people. Swans were kept almost like farm animals. They were allowed to breed in the wild and were rounded up each year by their owners.
Anybody on him?
No, on this side.
Pick him up, if you like.
We'll pick him up.
Pick him up, Alfie.
This strange ritual of swan upping once went on all over the country. Swans were protected birds because they were highly valued and their survival was never threatened.
Georgie! Signet, come in! Georgie, get over that bird.
One for us, yes, bit of a jade when she comes along.
They were cared for because they were prized as food. Swans fetched a higher price per pound than any other bird. Cygnets were fattened for the table, and hundreds were eaten at royal banquets.
Quebec 36.
Totally remember you at night in the Rowing Club. I'll tell you, Bill.
Quebec 36. Right, here we go.
Those birds not taken for the pot had their beaks marked to show who owned them.
Pull us up on the shore.
There were hundreds of swan marks at one time. Of course, nobody eats these birds today. Swan upping is a colourful survival of an old ritual that has found a new purpose. The uppers hand over their catch to a research team from Oxford University.
All right, go. Okay, got it.
blood samples are taken from the birds before they're released. The research team, funded by the swan owners, has been trying to answer a very worrying question. Why are the birds disappearing from the river? Swans had bred very successfully on the Thames, even in the centre of London, until the 1960s. But then their numbers had fallen, so that the swan upping began further and further out of town each year. What the research team discovered was that the swans were dying of lead poisoning, and the reason was the great rise in the popularity of angling. Swans were swallowing lead weights lost by anglers, and in heavily fished areas in our towns were dying out. Only the recent ban on lead weights could resolve this conflict between wildlife and a popular pastime. In many ways, people and wildlife are in competition in towns. This is true of cricketers, who need their own special habitat. Acres of mown turf. An overgrown area like this is useless to sportsmen and regarded as unsightly by many people. But it is, of course, a refuge for all kinds of interesting wild plants, which most gardeners call weeds. And these plants are essential for the survival of some kinds of wildlife. Now here's a good example, the stinging nettle. It's not a popular plant with people, but caterpillars need it to survive. Without this food plant, you won't get certain lovely butterflies like the peacock and the small tortoiseshell. There are lots of other examples of wildlife in towns needing things gardeners don't like. Goldfinches eat thistle seeds, but of course we usually mow these plants down. So there are lots of conflicts when wildlife moves into the city, but not always because they find it hard to survive. When wildlife is really successful, it's liable to become a pest. That's what happened with Canada geese, which love our manicured parks. Canada geese keep their chicks in a communal creche, and the very aggressive adults see off any danger. These birds, which have been introduced from North America, are disliked by many park keepers because they crop the grass too close, leave a lot of droppings, and take over the territory of other birds. In many parks, their eggs are taken before they hatch. So Canada geese are treated as a pest. And that's true of a great many successful town species. In late summer, Lord Nelson faces London's most spectacular wildlife invasion. Hundreds of thousands of starlings arrive in central London, flying in from 10 to 15 miles around to form enormous roosts. It's like a scene from a Hitchcock film. As the sun sets, park keepers in Leicester Square take air raid precautions. Starling droppings are the problem. Imagine the effect of this flock after a night in the square. So they try to drive the birds away. Starling alarm calls are played. and they even beat dustbins in a desperate effort to shift the birds. All this tub thumping may look pretty crazy, but you have to remember that cleaning up after the starlings costs Westminster Council thousands of pounds a year. Here's another example, in fact, of people trying to rid the town of wildlife which is too successful.
Hello, Peter. How's it?
Of course, when we think about rats and mice and all the creatures pest controllers try to get rid of, there's an awful lot of unwanted wildlife in towns.
Bevan House, Klein's House, Gilbert House.
Yes, yes.
Here, Peter Bateman of Rent-A-Kill is going into action against a really nasty invader. The ducts of this council block provide the ideal microclimate for the pests, and a poison is pumped in to attack them. These are Pharaoh's ants, a tropical species which thrives in the artificial warmth of centrally heated buildings. Peter Bateman explains.
The curse of the pharaohs. The pharaoh's ant really turned up about 100 years ago and was not a major problem other than in 1 or 2 hospitals. But it's since developed very considerably. It's probably now in 20% of London hospitals. It's in 11% of NHS hospitals throughout the country. And it's turning up in bakehouses, it's turning up in food factories, it's turning up in multi-storey high-rise blocks of flats. And one of the problems is that because of its very small size, it can get into things. Gets into sterile packs, gets into food, not above hopping into bed with the patients and getting into wounds. And because, unlike the garden ant, it doesn't necessarily just go for sweet food, it's a protein feeder, then it will get in among dirty dressings, sputum, blood, and so forth. And as it forages for food, in somewhere like a hospital or a food factory, it will carry around with it a lot of disease organisms. And all along, you will find that some form of creature will adapt itself to exploit man's environment. And there's this constant war, if you like, to keep one hop ahead of the pests that are threatening our food or our health or our property.
It should be fairly clear by now that when wildlife moves into the town, there are a very large number of conflicts, perhaps as many as there are actually out there in the countryside, with farmers, gamekeepers and chemicals. And of course, I've got the same conflict here in my garden. I've got a great deal of wildlife here, which of course I'm very fond of. But pests also come in and attack my plants. And then it's necessary for me to do something about it. And I think, providing I'm very careful, that doesn't really matter. Yet, there is a very lively movement amongst environmentalists and conservationists who are trying to persuade us that we should turn our gardens, like mine, into small nature reserves. Well, of course, they already are just that. Frogs and newts and all kinds of creatures will colonize your average suburban garden, even though it's not designed to encourage wildlife. The habitat we've created for ourselves will attract the kestrel, and in my garden, even wood mice, which come into the summer house. Magpies and lots of birds do very well in the well-kept suburban savannah. The old hedgehog likes it too. I didn't have to invite him here. When he felt like it, he just dropped in. this wildlife turns up whether we want it or not. Well, I like to nurture the wildlife in my garden, but I really can't see much point in pretending that it could be a Noah's Ark for wildlife that's running away from the countryside. The green spaces of our cities, the parks and gardens, are always in fact going to be for people rather than for wildlife. And there's not really a lot we could do to increase the variety of species that are coming in. And we shouldn't assume that everyone wants wildlife in their gardens. Some like it, and some don't. And there's an awful lot of disagreement where one animal is concerned. The fox has had a very mixed reception in town. It's actually encouraged by some people, like Mrs. Cox of Sidcup in South London.
During the winter, when it's snowing, and of course things like that, I automatically put food out for them because I think it's difficult for them. And I'd rather they ate the food off the lawn than ranch in my dustbin, which luckily for me they've never done yet. We have hedgehogs in the dustbin, but not foxes. Personally, I think they're great fun, just fun. And it's nice to see them, see the generations slowly going through, and I just enjoy them in my garden.
When it goes a couple of doors down, the old fox gets a very different reception from Mrs. Kerbait.
Well, we just don't really want them because we don't like the mess, we don't like the smell, and we are worried about one day if rabies comes to England, we reckon the foxes will be the animals that will carry it. Again. Dear, dear. If they're going to do this all over the suburbs, well, I just don't think it's a nice idea at all. Country animals should go back to the country.
Well, I, for one, don't agree with that. I think it's fantastic to see fox cubs in suburbia. I hope they and many other creatures do well here. What we've learned on this city safari is that, though it may not be running away from the countryside, a great deal of wildlife has done very well in our towns, whether we want it or not. And most of it, like the fox, is here to stay.